Okay. My name is Charles Penwell. I'm here today to introduce Oliver Haydorn. And Oliver, with a little input from me, is going to talk about the answer to inflation. Inflation has more or less been permanent in human society, except particularly for one experiment in Australia where it was absolutely stopped for a few years in a most difficult period. And that's not even talked about anymore, but we're going to break that and talk about it today. Oliver has a background teaching philosophy as a professor in American universities, but of recent years he's withdrawn from that and has been involving himself with research in economics, and that is part of the reason why he's here today making this video and sharing some of his research with us.
Yes, well, thank you, Chess. So we're going to be talking about inflation, as you said, and the most logical place to start would be with some sort of definition, right? What is inflation? What is this phenomenon? And probably the most general definition that we can come up with is the idea that when inflation occurs, it means that there's an increase across the board in the general level of prices of goods and services.
Yeah.
So the general price level is going up. What used to be priced at $10 is now priced at $12. What used to be priced at, say, $100 is now priced at $120. And that increase in prices we call inflation. Now what that means is that each unit of currency or credit is able to buy less and less as time goes on, right? So there's a dilution in the purchasing power of each unit of currency, and that simultaneously means that the cost of living, the general cost of living, is increasing over time, and it's becoming more difficult for people to make ends meet.
Inflation is sometimes defined as an increase in prices accompanied by an increase in the money supply, which suggests that that's the reason for, and it very often is, the reason for the increase in prices. But of course, prices can increase for other reasons like famine or pestilence or monopoly, and then I suppose under that definition is there just an increase in prices. So just bearing that in mind, an increase in prices may or may not be because an increase in the money supply, but when it is for an increase in the money supply, it is definitely inflation.
Yes. Yeah. All right, so we've described what inflation is, and the first observation that we should make is that it is a bad thing. Generally, it's a negative phenomenon. And the basic reason for that is when it occurs, it erodes people's purchasing power. So it erodes the purchasing power of everyone's savings. Anyone who has a bank account, who has money saved away, what they can buy with that money is going to be less and less as time goes on. It hurts those on fixed income, so people who are on pensions or here in Australia who are on Centrelink, unless it's adjusted, they're going to have a more difficult time making ends meet. It hurts those whose wages or salaries have not been adjusted to inflation, to the increase in prices. And it hurts everyone insofar as it introduces a certain amount of uncertainty and instability in the economy. So people have a harder time planning for the future. They have a harder time making decisions about investments. And of course it hurts borrowers who were on variable rates of interest and so forth. Now, if inflation gets worse over time, if it becomes what economists call galloping inflation or hyperinflation, then the very survival of the economy is at stake. So inflation, it's not a good thing, but it can become a very, very dangerous thing if it's allowed to get out of control. And that's something we want to sort of keep in people's minds, that it's...
Ultimately, it brings a breakdown in trust. And when scarcity prevails and there's no trust, then everybody starts to defend themselves, and the basis of all greed is scarcity, or the threat of scarcity, so you get those sort of problems. But one of the other things that inflation does is allow us to pay back our debts with lower value. It's not just the currency, well, it is the currency that loses its value, but debts can be repaid with less value. Now, it may be that interest rates and so on impinge on that, but one of the reasons I think that inflation hasn't been fought tooth and nail, because it allows people more readily to repay their debts,
Yes.
which in a sense allows them to go on inflating the economy because the debt is being lessened somewhat. I can't really explain why we don't address ending inflation, but that could be a reason. And certainly it got to the point where economies completely broke down, as they did in Germany in the 20s, and more recently in Zimbabwe, I think in the 1990s.
In Venezuela.
It was just impossible. What you could buy for a note in the morning, you need a wheelbarrow of notes in the afternoon, and this sort of thing. And it so destroyed society in Germany that, it made the population open to all sorts of outrageous auto-suggestions and calling for a strong man, and all sorts of things happened as a result of that.
Right. So this is the advantage, or the putative advantage of inflation, is basically it helps both the private sector and governments to inflate away the size of the debt. Right. So past debts then don't become quite as burdensome or quite as onerous if the general price level is going up and the money supply is being increased and so forth. Yeah,
if a bag of potatoes was worth $10 last year, and you had a debt of $10, you could pay it off with a bag of potatoes. But if a bag of potatoes is worth $20 this year because of inflation, you can pay off your $10 debt with half a bag of potatoes.
Right.
That's about how it works in relation to the real world.
Right. So we would suggest basically that historically inflation, a certain rate of inflation has been tolerated, probably for this reason.
Yep.
But even so, if that gets out of hand, the whole economy is threatened.
Yeah.
So
The whole thing could fall down. And that's happened quite often. There's a lot of illusory things that happen with inflation too. Like people think they're getting richer because the price of their house is going up in numbers. But if they sell their house, they'll only get enough money to buy a house of equal value, no matter what the inflation rate is, If it's
just a one-for-one sort of
That's
exchange.
right. They've only got the price of the house in that economy of that value, and you can't buy a house and buy two of the same value. All you're doing is getting inflated numbers. And that can be of advantage if you're going to go and live in a tent because you get enough money to buy a lot of hamburgers and Coca-Colas.
Other things. Certainly in my country that wouldn't be a viable option because it's too cold.
It's a bit cold there, yeah. Yeah, well, that's right. Well, we could probably do a bit better in a Gunya here. But still, it's fairly difficult to live in a modern world if you haven't got a roof over your computer,
All right, so the next thing that I wanted to discuss is what are the causes of inflation. We've touched on this a bit earlier, but it's worth exploring again. The most common explanation for the phenomenon of inflation is what is referred to as demand pull, right? So some people will say, well, if inflation is happening, it's because there's too much money chasing too few goods.
That's it.
Right? So when the money supply is increased to a greater extent than what the productive and consumptive activities of the economy require or can handle, we end up with too much money chasing too few goods, and retailers are sensitive to this. They see that consumers are demanding more and more, and there's more money in their pockets. So to take advantage of that situation, they increase their prices, and that absorbs the surplus, right? Reestablishing a balance between the money available and the prices of goods and services, the general price level. And as they do that, then demand will subside. So that's basically the idea that the money supply increases, and so we've got to increase prices to keep the two in balance, and that's demand pull. Now, there is a second form or second cause of inflation that's being recognized more and more, which is cost push. And in the case of cost push, it's not the increase in the money supply that's driving the increase in prices, but rather something else has happened on the supply side which is causing producers and retailers to increase prices. So generally something's happened at the level of costs. Maybe there's, as you were saying, there's some event that's occurred, like a natural disaster or a war, or there have been disruptions in the supply chains, the supply lines. There's been disruptions in distribution, and because of this, to cover increased costs, retailers have to up their prices. So we have an example of this in Australia, which is pertinent to what we'll be discussing soon about possible ways of addressing inflation or solving the inflation problem. During the Second World War in Australia, there was a transfer of efficient labor from regular productive industry to war activities, war services. And this increased the cost of production because industry had to make do with labor that was less skilled, less experienced, and so they were less efficient. And as a result, costs went up. Right? They needed to work them longer hours in order to get the same level of output.
We took 500,000 of our most able people and put them in uniform, which has made a big difference. There's just one thing about the cost push and demand pull. I remember clearly one Christmas Eve, I was shopping with my wife, and there were an enormous number of shoppings in this shopping centre, quite an upmarket shopping centre, and the goods were pouring out, and they were replacing them. There was nothing like a shelf. Every shelf was absolutely chockers. And then I was reminded of the idea that inflation is caused by too much money chasing too few goods. But too few goods wasn't evident. The goods were just seemingly inexhaustible at that time and place.
Right.
And okay, there might have been a bit of money around, but these things have got to be borne in mind.
Yes. And a further complication is that whether you're dealing with, let's say, demand pull or cost push, there's another aspect of cost push which tends to enter the picture, and that is that if people can't, let's say because interest rates have gone up and they're paying more on their mortgages and this sort of thing, if they can't meet the cost of living as they're acquainted or used to doing, one of the things that they'll do is they'll go to their employer and they'll demand wage increases or salary increases in order to maintain the sort of lifestyle that they're used to. This might provide a sort of temporary relief, but in the end it's no solution because those increases have to be met in increased prices.
The consumer pays all costs.
Consumer pays all costs.
He pays all costs. If they're private costs, he pays in prices. If company costs, he pays in prices. And if it's government cost, he pays it in taxes.
Right.
The consumer pays everything.
Right.
Ultimately.
So if we increase wages and increase salaries in order to give people more money, eventually that's going to filter into increased consumer prices as well. And so it's no permanent solution. There's the danger of falling into a wage price spiral, which is another form of cost push, essentially.
That's right.
Yeah. Whenever inflation appears to be happening, and they say, well, there's too much money chasing too few goods, and inflation is greater, let's say, than 2%, that's the target that the central banks aim for, the conventional response is to raise the interest rates. This will have the effect of tightening everyone's belts, so anyone who has any kind of debt will have to, if it wasn't locked in, they'd have to pay more for, let's say, mortgage loans, car loans, business loans, credit cards, and taxes to service government loans. And that, of course, increases the cost of living. And so the idea is that by increasing those costs, we can mop up some of this extra money that's laying about that is somehow contributing to too much money chasing too few goods.
I see it as a situation where what government authorities have is it's a one-trick pony. They've got this one trick, which is to put up interest rates. Now, if you put up interest rates, of course, it increases cost push. The industry has more costs. And, of course, those with house mortgages get severely savaged, so they tend to spend less. So what the answer to inflation now, when you analyse it right down, is that the answer is to sicken the economy. If it gets sicker, where people have to tighten their belts, hold back from properly using the economy fully, then that will dampen it down. And if it's like most things that are a bit sick, they tend to slow up a bit, and that they can tell themselves that they're stopping inflation. They're actually stopping the economy, but one of its side effects is that that prices tend to slow up in rising, if not fall, and very seldom they don't fall.
Right.
This never made them fall, but it does slow up the rise.
The rate of inflation.
And when it gets below a certain rate of 2 or 3% or whenever they're happy, they decide that they'll let the economy become a little more well again, so that it can start to operate a little bit more like normally.
Right.
So that's how I see the current. And they're not trying to stop inflation. Nobody talks about stopping inflation. They talk about controlling it. They only want to control it. They don't want to stop it.
So there's a lot of collateral damage that's involved with this method of trying to slow the rate of inflation, right? You've got bankruptcies,
You have stress,
people lose their jobs, people lose their
marriages
homes.
break down.
Yeah.
There's all sorts of side effects like that. Which, if there is a means of stopping inflation, that's all unnecessary. You don't have to make the economy sick to control inflation.
Yes. I was thinking that this method of trying to respond to the threat of inflation is sort of analogous to the use of chemotherapy in allopathic medicine, because when someone has a cancer diagnosis and you go to a conventional doctor to treat it, the whole idea is that we will inject your body with poisonous chemicals in the hope that these poisonous chemicals will kill the cancer cells before it kills the healthy cells.
Yes.
Right? And so that's why chemotherapy is such a terrible, unpleasant experience for a lot of people, because you are injecting yourself with something that's not supposed to be there.
Yep.
And so it's somewhat analogous in that they realize inflation is a problem beyond a certain level,
Yep.
and they're trying to reduce it, but there's a lot of fallout there.
Yep.
Before they can declare the threat has passed and we can return to something resembling normalcy.
Yeah, stop curing the thing so that the patient can become normal and healthy again.
Yes.
It's a bit like that, you know. And if it's wholly unnecessary, well, that's another matter, and we believe it is wholly unnecessary, of course.
So you end up with a situation where consumers are lacking in purchasing power. They can't maintain the standard of living. They can't buy the things that they were accustomed to buying. And so businesses, in order to survive in that environment, what are their choices? One of the things that they can do is to not increase prices in keeping with their costs, but to basically subsidize the consumer out of their own private stores of capital for however long that they can do that, in the hope that business conditions will eventually improve.
Yeah.
And so that is essentially what's happening, is that the raising of interest rates is forcing businesses to provide something like a consumer price discount. It forces
businesses to sell at a loss so they can keep going.
Correct.
And that tends to bring prices down to some extent. But it's depreciating, it's taking away from businesses' reserves, or adding to businesses' debts. And as soon as that stops, of course, that's all got to be replaced.
Right.
So we go rushing ahead again.
So the advantage of what we're proposing is that it benefits not just the consumer, but also the business world.
That is right. The amazing thing about this is that those figures we're quoting are from the Australian Bureau of Statistics, though these numbers were put down in the annual yearbook, number 37, which was produced in 1946 and 47. And they gave a full account of this whole process and what it meant and how it stopped inflation and how it didn't when it wasn't used. And so it's authoritative. It's not us saying this. This is the official government publication saying, yes, we can stop inflation. We have done it. This is exactly how we've done it. And it worked.
Yes.
But when the war started in September 1939, what they used as the Consumer Price Index, they called it the C-Index series at the time, was at a level of 1,000. And when the war started, they introduced a whole lot of price controls. You couldn't just put a price on something. You had to get the government's consent to charge a certain amount. So they tried to control inflation by putting price controls on it. And they went across the board on just about everything. So 3 3/4 years later, the prices had increased to 1,248. Starting at 1,000, we got to 1,248 in less than 4 years. With all the price controls and all the wartime powers, and everybody was happy to give the government those wartime powers. They thought they were essential, but it doesn't work like that. If the price you can charge for an item is $1, but the costs of producing it go to $1.20. You've got two choices. You either say, yes, you can increase the price to $1.20, or you can say, no, you can't, in which case the item is not produced. So really price control was just a yes sir, no sir, 3 bags full type of mechanism. It didn't work. It could never work, because you can control the top price, but you can't control the bottom price without stopping production altogether. So John Curtin was the Prime Minister, and he'd been influenced by the thinking of C.H. Douglas as a younger man before he went into politics. I've had this personally from old supporters of Douglas in Western Australia right back in the 70s and 80s. So he decided he wasn't going to control inflation, he was going to stop it. So he introduced these discounts. He used some of the money being issued to fund the war effort, he used some of it to discount down prices. For instance, household electricity was discounted down. They had a discount on the price of potatoes. They used that money to decrease the sales tax from 12.5% down to 7.5%. And so prices started to fall. They didn't start putting interest rates up and costs up to control inflation. They actually brought prices down to control inflation. They brought them down to stop inflation, and it did. Having gone from an index of 1,000 in September 1939, in June 1943, 3.5 years later, inflation was up 25% from the beginning of the war at 1,248 index. And then they introduced those discounts we've talked about. 1 3/4 years later, it had gone down from 1,248 to 1,229. A small decrease, 1.4%, but it's going the other direction. It's never gone the other direction any time in Australian history other than that, and you can't find it in other countries either. And that was at the most difficult time that we ever had to control inflation, because we had to keep spending it on the war effort. You know, we had to keep everybody fully there, or we'd go out of existence altogether. So the thing worked. Unfortunately, having done that magnificent thing and proven that this thing works, John Curtin died largely of overwork in 1945, and as soon as he did, they stopped this. So it went from 1,229 in September 45. 2 years later, it was 1,310. It had gone up 17%. So we had inflation running at quite high levels till they introduced these discounts. When they stopped them, it went on rising at quite high levels, and it's never stopped. So you can stop it, but you've got to mean to stop it. And you've got to give up ideas of trying to control it and trying to sicken the economy by putting up interest rates, which really impacts on people with mortgages and also forces industry to subsidise. I've known about this, 30, 40 years. I've never seen it mentioned in the major media. This is something that never happened. You could never stop inflation. No, you can't stop it. We just try to control it. So we've got to say, well, hang on. Let's go back to number 37. It's easy to discover there, and it's quite well explained and fully explained. And when we've had enough, when we're sick of inflation, we want to stop it, we can do it. But if we go on saying people, well, we want some of it or a bit of it, and we'll control it, and we won't let it get out of hand, it's going to go on forever.
Yes. The other interesting thing is the Curtin government was a Labor government.
Yep.
And we have a Labor government in power in Australia now, so it behooves them to look at their predecessors and see, it was Labor policy at one time.
Yeah, that's right.
So why can't it be revived?
But they were a different world, and they're a bit more practical in those times. And the reason that John Curtin did it is because it worked. You know, you're welcome to do whatever you like about inflation. If you're not going to do what works, what do you expect? And it's a bit sad they don't acknowledge the greatness of their earlier people. Some of those, I remember, this is just an aside if you like, one day I was talking to the bagman of the National Party, the arch Tories in Queensland. This is a bloke who used to go around and collect money for them, from businesses and so on. And he'd been around a long time, and he used to give advice about protocol and things like that when they were visiting dignitaries. So he was associated with government a long time in Queensland. And I said to him, who's your favourite Prime Minister? This is a Tory. He said, John Curtin. John Curtin was head and shoulders over the lump. He knew Bob Menzies, he knew all the rest of them. John Curtin was his man. So this is a guy we need to go back and find those genuine heroes that weren't phonies and apply things that work. Let's try that. You know, in desperation, we might try something that'll work.
It actually works. Yeah. So one objection that is probably going to be raised at this point to the idea of, you know, introducing consumer price discounts to neutralize inflation would be, you know, where is the money going to come from? If this means increasing public debt, then eventually that public debt is going to have to be serviced, and so you'll be giving with one hand and taking back with the other. And is this really a long-term solution? Now, as far as I understand it, yes, the Labour government during the Second World War did manage to stop inflation and even to reverse inflation, but it was done purely within the realm of orthodox finance. And there's an important piece of the puzzle here where we want to suggest, yes, price discounts are the way to go, but we can do something even better than what the Curtin government did insofar as through introducing some form of monetary change, monetary reform, we can actually fund it in a way that is not going to increase the public debt and so will not put a burden on, let's say, future generations.
What we're saying is that it's possible to think outside the box. It is possible. And as to how we fund discounts on prices, we can fund them the same way that everything is financed. Everything is financed by banks creating credit. The primary function of banks is to create and, yes, to destroy money. When they make loans, that increases the amount of deposits that are there because the loans are spent. And bank deposits are what we use as money now. Not notes, not coins, very little, less than 2%. Our money supply is bank deposits. Now, they create bank deposits when they make loans. And, you know, when they insist that they're paid back, that destroys money. The banks, half of their function is in destroying money. So what we're saying is that it's possible, if we're going to look at creating money, which we are, and it's the only way we get it, we can create it with a plus sign in front of it or a negative sign. If it's got a negative sign, it's debt and it's got to be repaid. If it's a plus sign, it can go into the economy and actually cancel out some of the debt. So we can create money with a positive sign in front of it that will not only reduce prices and stop inflation, stop it, not control it, stop it. It will also negate and cancel out the amount of debt in society to the same amount, because you can only cancel a negative with a positive. That's all that will do it. So then the whole cost structure starts to come down. So we can do better than they did during the war. At least we could do that. If we did nothing more, at least it would be a big help. But we can go better again by financing it with positive money, not negative money. And there is the future of the human economy, really. Once we get to that, we'll be past a lot of this bloody nonsense about pushing and shoving and you're getting too much and I'm getting too little, and controlling us and regulating us and all that sort of thing, and a lot of scarcity. I think we can have a much happier economy if we just sensibly solve some of the big problems by using measures to stop inflation and measures that not only do that but also negate the level of debt in society.
There's a real opportunity, in other words, not only to deal properly with this problem of inflation, but actually to set the whole economy on a much more sound and satisfactory basis.
Yeah. To roll back the enormous structure of debt, where, you know, I'm told that debt in the world now is 200 trillion. The American debt is $90 trillion. I mean, debt is going up every year, and they think that it has to go up because otherwise we won't have enough money to keep going. So we've got to keep creating more debt, because that's the only way we can get money at the moment, and we've got to have money to keep going. So it's a bloody madness, and we need to think about ways to stop it, and it is stoppable. Debt is stoppable in the same way that inflation is stoppable. You know, and it comes down to simple techniques that are logical and obvious, and that aren't aimed at preserving vested interests.